The lights inside the grand showroom glowed the color of warm honey, spilling gently across polished tables and glasses that caught the shine like tiny stars. It was one of those nights where everything felt rehearsed by fate itself, the orchestra already settled into their places, the audience buzzing with anticipation, and the hum of expectation floating just beneath the ceiling like a held breath. When Dean Martin stepped onto the stage, dressed in his tailored suit, relaxed smile in place, the room responded instantly. Applause rolled forward in waves, not forced, not polite, but earned. Dean had that effect on people. He didn't demand attention, he invited it. It's like an old friend pulling out a chair and saying, "Sit, relax." "Tonight's on me." Dean began the show the way he always did, with effortless charm. His voice flowed smoothly, rich and playful, teasing the audience just enough to make them feel like they were part of the act. He cracked a joke, lifted his glass in mock salute, and sang the opening notes of a familiar tune. Laughter followed naturally, the kind that loosened shoulders and softened faces. In that moment, the room felt united strangers sharing the same rhythm. The same smiles, the same sense that, for a little while, the world outside didn't matter. But then, somewhere between a pause in the music and the echo of applause, something shifted. It wasn't loud enough at first to stop the show outright. It came from deep within the audience, a voice that didn't belong to the harmony of the room. A few heads turned instinctively. A few smiles froze. The word itself didn't need to be repeated, carried its weight in the way it landed. Sharp and ugly, slicing through the warmth like broken glass. A remark soaked in ignorance. A moment that shouldn't have existed, did. The band hesitated. Dean heard it at first. His expression didn't change. Years in the spotlight had trained him not to react too quickly, not to give the unexpected more power than it deserved. But something subtle happened. His eyes shifted, not in anger, but in focus. The playful energy paused, suspended in the air like a dropped note that hadn't yet hit the floor. The room grew quieter, not because anyone asked it to, but because everyone felt it. Some people laughed nervously, unsure how to respond. Others looked down at their tables. A few glanced toward Dean, waiting, watching. Dean didn't speak right away. Instead, he took a breath. A long one. The kind that comes not from surprise, but from decision. He lowered the microphone slightly, letting the silence stretch just enough to make people uncomfortable but not afraid. In that silence lived a question. What kind of man is he going to be right now? Dean Martin had built his career on humor, music, and ease, but beneath the relaxed persona lived something sturdier. He had shared stages with legends, broken barriers quietly, and stood beside people who were often treated unfairly by a world that didn't understand them. He didn't shout about it. He didn't make speeches. He simply showed up, again and again, choosing decency when it was easier not to. The audience didn't know it yet, but this night was about to become something more than entertainment. Dean lifted the microphone again, not abruptly, but calmly. His posture remained loose, his tone unhurried. He scanned the room once, letting his gaze pass over faces of every kind, young and old. Dressed in elegance, dressed in humility, all gathered under the same roof. When he finally spoke, his voice wasn't sharp. It wasn't angry. It was steady, and that steadiness was louder than any shout. He didn't single anyone out. He didn't repeat what was said. He didn't escalate. Instead, he spoke like a man addressing family, reminding them who they were supposed to be when they forgot. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, pausing just long enough for the weight of his words to settle. "This room is full of people who came here to laugh, to listen, and to feel a little lighter tonight." The crowd leaned in. "And that only works," Dean continued, "when we remember that respect is part of the music." The silence was complete now. Even the clink of glasses had stopped. Dean smiled, not the carefree grin from earlier, but something quieter, something sincere. "I've shared stages with some of the finest people this world has ever known," he said. "Men and women who taught me that talent doesn't have a color, and dignity doesn't ask permission." A murmur rippled through the room. Dean straightened slightly. Still calm, still controlled. "So tonight," he added gently. "We leave the small thinking outside. In here, we're better than that. No accusation, no lecture. Just truth, delivered softly, and therefore impossible to ignore." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then something remarkable happened. Applause began not explosive at first, but intentional. One table, then another, then rows upon rows, until the entire room was standing. Not cheering for a punchline, not reacting out of excitement, but acknowledging something rare, a moment where kindness didn't need volume to win. Dean nodded once, appreciative, but not triumphant. He waited for the applause to fade on its own, then lifted the microphone again. "Now," he said lightly, the warmth returning to his voice, "where were we?" Laughter followed, but this time it was different, cleaner, shared, the kind that comes after a storm passes and everyone realizes they're still standing together. The band resumed. The show continued. But long after the music faded and the lights dimmed, the people who were there would remember that night not for the song Dean sang, but for the one he didn't. Because sometimes the most powerful line isn't written into the script. It's spoken when silence demands it. The applause that followed Dean's words did not vanish the moment the band struck its next chord. It lingered in the air, echoing faintly, even as the music resumed and the show carried on. To most of the audience, it felt like closer, powerful moment neatly resolved, a reminder of decency wrapped in charm. They laughed again, clapped again, and allowed themselves to sink back into the comfort of entertainment. But behind the curtain, where the lights were dimmer and the smiles less rehearsed, the night was only just beginning. Backstage, the corridors smelled of old wood, cologne, and warm electrical heat from the stage lights. Crew members moved with quiet efficiency, some whispering to each other, others stealing glances toward the stage monitors where Dean's performance continued as if nothing extraordinary had occurred, yet everyone felt it. Something had shifted. The show was still a show, but the meaning behind it had grown heavier, deeper, more personal. Near the far end of the corridor stood a young trumpet player named Elijah. Barely 22, his jacket still too new, his hands trembling just slightly as he held his instrument. This was his first major venue, his first time playing in a room like this, sharing space with a legend. When the Remark had cut through the air earlier, Elijah's breath had caught in his throat. Not because he hadn't heard such ignorance before he had, but because he hadn't expected it here. Not tonight. Not in a room that felt so polished, so safe. When Dean responded, Elijah hadn't clapped at first. He had frozen, eyes fixed on the monitor, heart pounding. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because for the first time he saw what real strength looked like. Not loud, not aggressive, not angry, just firm, unavoidable. And now, as the show continued, Elijah stood there replaying Dean's words in his head, realizing something unsettling and beautiful at the same time. The courage he'd just witnessed wasn't part of the act. It was the man. Elsewhere backstage, a stage manager leaned against a wall, rubbing his temples. He had spent years smoothing over conflicts, keeping sponsors happy, ensuring that nothing ever disrupted the illusion of perfection. When the incident happened, his first instinct had been panic, moral outrage, but fear. Fear of headlines, fear of complaints, fear of consequences. And yet Dean hadn't looked to him for guidance. Hadn't asked permission, he had simply spoken. And somehow, instead of disaster, the room had responded with unity. That terrified the stage manager. More than chaos ever could. In a quiet corner near the dressing rooms, a woman sat alone, hands folded tightly in her lap. Her name was Margaret Lewis, and she hadn't planned on being noticed at all that evening. She was a school teacher from out of town, invited by a former student who now worked as a lighting assistant. Margaret had almost declined the ticket, unsure if she belonged in a place like this. The dresses, the laughter, the confidence, it all felt foreign to her. But she came anyway, telling herself that maybe, just once, she deserved a night where she didn't have to be responsible for anyone else. When the Remark rang out earlier, Margaret's chest had tightened, not out of shock, but recognition. She had spent decades teaching children about respect, empathy, and the quiet dignity of every human being, only to watch many of those lessons undone by the world outside her classroom. In that moment, she had felt very small, very tired. Dean's words didn't make her cry. They didn't make her cheer. They did something far more powerful. They made her sit up straighter. Back on stage, Dean moved through the remainder of the performance with the same grace he always had. But inside, his thoughts were far from settled. He didn't show it. He never did. To the audience, he was still the same relaxed figure, glass in hand, voice steady. But between verses, between jokes, his mind drifted not to the person who had spoken out of ignorance, but to the many people who had heard it and wondered, even for a second, whether silence would follow. Dean had seen silence before. Too much of it. He remembered rooms where talent was celebrated but humanity was negotiable. Remembered nights when people laughed, along with cruelty, because it was easier than standing alone. He had promised himself long ago that if he ever had the chance to make a room better even for a moment, he wouldn't waste it. When the final note faded and the curtain closed, the crowd rose again, applause swelling with admiration. Dean bowed lightly, offering a modest wave before disappearing into the wings. As soon as he stepped off stage, the noise dropped away, replaced by the low murmur of backstage life. A handler moved toward him with a towel. Someone else offered congratulations. Dean nodded politely, thanked them, but his attention was already elsewhere. He stopped walking. Near the edge of the corridor stood Elijah, trumpet still in hand, eyes wide, unsure whether to speak or step aside. Dean noticed him immediately. Not because Elijah stood out, but because he looked like someone carrying something heavy without realizing it. Dean approached slowly, casually, as if this were any other night. "You played beautifully out there," Dean said. His voice low, sincere. Elijah blinked, stunned. "Thank you." "Sir," he managed. Dean studied him for a moment, then added, "Never let anyone convince you that your place on that stage depends on anything other than what you bring to it." Elijah swallowed hard. He nodded, unable to trust his voice. Dean clapped him gently on the shoulder and moved on, leaving behind words that would echo for years down the hall. Margaret was preparing to leave, her coat draped over her arm. As she turned a corner, she nearly collided with Dean himself. She froze, startled, instinctively apologizing. "No harm done," Dean said with a warm smile. She hesitated, then spoke before she could stop herself. "What you said tonight? It mattered." Dean didn't deflect it with humor this time. He simply nodded. "I hoped it would," he replied. Margaret smiled, something easing in her chest that had been tight for a long time. She didn't ask for an autograph, didn't ask for a photograph. She didn't need proof. The moment itself was enough. As the building began to empty and the lights dimmed, whispers started to spread, not gossip, but reflection. People talked quietly about what they had witnessed, about how unexpected it was, about how necessary. Some would forget details by morning. Others wouldn't, and very few would carry that moment forward, letting it challenge them the next time silence felt easier than courage. Dean returned to his dressing room alone, closing the door gently behind him. He loosened his tie, sat down, and stared at his reflection in the mirror. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, almost to himself, he murmured, "That's how it's supposed to be."
Outside.
The night moved on, unaware that something important had taken place within those walls. But the true impact of what happened was still unfolding, because words spoken in the right moment don't end when the room goes quiet, they begin there. The morning after the show did not arrive gently. It came with the low hum of radios, the rustle of newspapers, and the quiet conversations that start long before the sun fully rises. By the time the city shook off its sleep, the night Dean Martin thought would fade quietly into memory had already begun to stretch beyond the walls of the theater. What had happened on that stage, spoken without anger, delivered without spectacle, had unsettled more than a room. It had unsettled people. Dean woke early as he often did after performances. Years of late nights had taught him that sleep came easier when he didn't chase it. He sat at the small table near the window of his hotel suite, coffee untouched, watching light creep across the buildings outside. There was a stillness in those early hours that he appreciated, a time when the world hadn't yet decided what it wanted from him. But even in that quiet, Dean felt it. A pressure, not fear. Responsibility he had known, the moment he spoke, that the words wouldn't stay contained. Moments like that never did. Down in the lobby, a bellhop unfolded a newspaper, eyebrows lifting slightly as he scanned the entertainment section. Not because Dean's name was there, that wasn't unusual, but because the tone was different. The headline didn't talk about the songs, the jokes, or the crowd size. It talked about a pause, about a line delivered in calm defiance, about a room that stood together afterward. The article avoided repeating what had been said by the audience member. Instead, it focused on what Dean chose not to tolerate. By mid-morning, phones began ringing. Dean's manager called first, voice measured, cautious. "You made an impression last night." Dean smiled faintly. That was the idea. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Not everyone will be pleased. Dean sipped his coffee at last, unfazed. They don't have to be. That answer ended the conversation more effectively than any argument could have. Across town, reactions varied. Some praised the moment as dignified, overdue, necessary. Others called it unnecessary, claiming entertainment should remain untouched by reality. Letters began to arrive, some handwritten, some typed, some unsigned. A few were grateful beyond words. A few were cold, clipped, disapproving. Dean didn't read all of them. He didn't need to. He knew the world well enough to understand that when you choose to stand still in your values, others will accuse you of moving too far. What surprised him wasn't the backlash. It was the invitation. That afternoon, Dean was asked to attend a private meeting before his next scheduled appearance. No reporters. No announcements. Just a quiet request from venue representatives and sponsors who suddenly felt uneasy. The room they met in was polished and formal, designed to make difficult conversations feel controlled. Men in pressed suits sat around a long table, folders neatly aligned, expressions rehearsed. Dean arrived alone. No entourage. No lawyer. No show. One of the men cleared his throat. "Last night was unexpected." Dean nodded. "Life usually is." Another man leaned forward. "There are concerns. Some believe moments like that could divide audiences." Dean folded his hands calmly on the table. Respect doesn't divide people. It reveals them. The room shifted. No one interrupted him. "I've been on stages long enough to know when silence protects the wrong thing." Dean continued evenly. "If that costs me a few claps, I'll survive." There it was. The tension they hadn't wanted spoken aloud. A third man, younger than the others, hesitated before speaking. "You realize some doors could close." Dean met his gaze without hostility. "I also know some doors aren't worth walking through." The meeting ended sooner than expected. No threats were made. None were needed. Everyone understood what had been said. As Dean stood to leave, the younger man remained seated, eyes lowered, as if wrestling with something unspoken. Just before Dean reached the door, the man spoke quietly. "My father would have been proud of what you did."
Oh.
Dean paused, then nodded once. That was enough. That evening, as the city prepared for another show, the energy felt different. There was an edge beneath the excitement, a sense that people weren't just coming for music anymore. They were coming to see, to witness, to decide for themselves what kind of man Dean Martin truly was beyond the charm. Backstage, Elijah stood again with his trumpet, but this time his hands were steady. He had received messages from family members who had seen the article, who had heard whispers, who suddenly spoke with a pride they hadn't always known how to express. The night before had given him something he didn't expect, a feeling that maybe he didn't have to shrink to fit into rooms like this. Margaret, the schoolteacher, sat in the audience once more, invited by her former student who insisted she return. This time, she didn't feel like an outsider. She felt like a witness. She watched the crowd carefully, noting who leaned forward, who listened, who whispered. She wondered how many people were quietly carrying the same questions she had asked her students for years. What do you do when you're uncomfortable? What do you do when silence feels safer? When Dean stepped onto the stage again, the applause was immediate, but different, less automatic, more intentional. He acknowledged it with a small bow, then launched into the show without reference to the previous night. No speeches, no reminders. He let the music speak first, but halfway through the performance, something happened. A disturbance, not a slur, not a shout, but a challenge. A voice called out from the darkness, sharp with accusation. Why bring that stuff into a show meant to entertain? The room tensed instantly. Security shifted. The band faltered. Dean raised a hand. He didn't look angry. He didn't look surprised. He looked prepared. He stepped closer to the edge of the stage, letting the lights fall more softly across his face. Entertainment, he said calmly, isn't about pretending we don't live in the same world. The audience was silent. It's about reminding us we do. No argument followed. No escalation. The voice didn't respond. Whether the person understood or simply retreated didn't matter. What mattered was that the room stayed intact. No shouting. No division. Just a collective exhale as the band resumed and the show carried on. But backstage afterward, Dean felt it the weight of repetition. Standing once was easy. Standing again required endurance. Later that night, alone once more, Dean stared out at the city lights from his window. He thought about the cost not in money or fame, but in energy. In the quiet toll of always choosing the harder path when the easier one was offered freely. And yet, when he thought of Elijah's steady hands, Margaret's straightened posture, and the young man in the meeting room who spoke of his father, the answer became clear. Some moments don't belong to you once you create them. They belong to everyone. We needed them, and Dean knew. With a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that the most difficult test was still ahead, one that wouldn't come from a crowd, a sponsor, or a stranger in the dark. It would come from someone who believed Dean owed him silence. The night it finally came did not announce itself with noise. There was no warning, no restless crowd, no single voice cutting through the air. Instead, it arrived quietly, disguised as routine, tucked inside the familiar rhythm of another performance on another stage. That was how the most important moments often came. When everyone assumed the hardest part was already over, Dean Martin stood alone in the wings, listening to the orchestra tune their instruments. The sound drifted toward him in fragment, strings tightening, brass warming, a pianist testing a single note again and again. He rolled his shoulders once, a habit more than a necessity, and looked down at his hands. They were steady. They always were. Not because he was fearless, but because he had learned something more durable than confidence: resolve. In the weeks since that first night, the world around him had grown louder. Letters still came. Some kind, some bitter. A few threatening enough that his staff suggested caution. Dean waved those concerns away, not recklessly, but deliberately. He had spent his life on stages, in rooms where applause could vanish overnight and loyalty could shift with the tide. Fear had never been a reliable compass. What weighed on him now was something else: expectation. People were no longer just watching Dean Martin the entertainer. They were watching Dean Martin the man, searching for consistency, for proof that the moment they'd witnessed wasn't an exception. And tonight, in a sold-out hall, packed tighter than usual, expectation hummed beneath the surface like live wire, and the audience sat familiar faces and unfamiliar intentions. Industry figures, critics, admirers, skeptics, and somewhere among them, Dean knew this as surely as he knew the lyrics to every song he'd ever sung, someone who wanted him to falter. Backstage, Elijah adjusted his jacket, trumpet resting against his leg. He had been invited to sit closer to the front that evening, a quiet acknowledgement of how far he'd come in a short time. He didn't know who arranged it. He suspected Dean. The thought filled him with a mixture of gratitude and pressure. He reminded himself of Dean's words, "Your place depends on what you bring." He inhaled slowly, steadying himself. Margaret was there too, seated among strangers who felt less strange than before. She carried no ticket stub this time, only a notebook tucked into her bag. The same one she'd used for lesson plans for decades. She wasn't there to write. She was there to remember. The curtain rose. Dean stepped into the light. The applause came fast and full, louder than it had ever been. He acknowledged it briefly, not feeding it, not deflecting it, accepting it, as one accepts weather. The show began smoothly, songs flowing one into the next, laughter rising and falling exactly where it should. To anyone watching casually, it was just another brilliant performance. But tension doesn't need chaos to exist. It needs waiting. Midway through the set, during a quiet moment between numbers, it happened. Not a shout, not a slur, but something more calculated. A man stood up near the back, clapping slowly, deliberately, drawing attention without raising his voice. Heads turned. The clapping stopped. "So," the man said evenly, "are we here for music or for lessons?" The room froze. Security started to move, but Dean raised a hand again. Calm, practiced, unmistakable. He took a step forward, closer to the edge of the stage, letting the light find him fully. He didn't rush his response. He didn't sharpen his tone. He simply looked at the man, really looked at him. As if trying to understand what kind of emptiness demanded to be filled by confrontation. "We're here," Dean said at last. "For honesty," a murmur swept the room. The man scoffed. "That's not what I paid for." Dean nodded slowly, as though considering the statement. "No," he replied. "You paid for a seat. What you do with it is up to you." The crowd stirred, tension rippling like a held breath. Dean continued, his voice still level, still human. "Music has always taught lessons. Sometimes about love, sometimes about loss, and sometimes about how we treat the people sitting right next to us." The man opened his mouth to respond, but Dean lifted a finger, not as a warning, but as a pause. "I won't argue with you," Dean said, "because arguments try to win. I'm only interested in understanding." The silence that followed was heavier than noise. The man sat down, not defeated, not converted, but contained. And that, in that moment, was enough. Dean turned back toward the orchestra. "Let's keep going," he said softly. The band resumed. But something irreversible had. It's already happened. The rest of the show unfolded without incident. Yet everyone in the room felt it, the sense that they had crossed a threshold. That they had seen not just restraint, but conviction tested and held. When the final song ended, and the applause rose one last time, it wasn't thunderous. It was reverent. Backstage, after the curtain fell, Dean lingered longer than usual, accepting thanks, nodding to musicians, exchanging quiet words that carried more weight than speeches ever could. Elijah approached him once more, this time with confidence in his stride. "I saw what you did," Elijah said. Dean smiled faintly. "We all did." Margaret waited until the hall had nearly emptied before making her way toward the exit. As she passed the stage door, she paused, looking back once. She thought of her students past and future and of how she would describe this night if words were ever required. She decided she wouldn't talk about confrontation at all. She would talk about calm. Later, alone again. Dean returned to his room, loosened his tie, and sat by the window as he had so many nights before. The city lights shimmered below, indifferent, yet eternal. He felt tired, not the exhaustion of performance, but the deeper fatigue that comes from choosing integrity again and again when no one forces you to. And yet, beneath that fatigue, there was peace. Dean understood now that the line he had drawn on that first night was no longer his alone. It had been carried forward, spoken in other voices, held in other hearts. It would surface in classrooms and quiet conversations, moments where someone chose courage without applause. That was the real legacy, not the songs, not the laughter, not even the fame, but the reminder that dignity doesn't need permission, and kindness doesn't require volume. The lights outside eventually dimmed, but the line. Dean Martin spoke without shouting, without hatred, without fear, would outlive every stage he ever stood on. And in that, he had said more than any encore ever could.